Hello, PAX Online. Welcome to the first virtualized PAX. This is very weird. We're all in tiny windows on my computer. I am Dylan Ilvento. I'm the co-founder of War Games. I'm moderating this panel. This panel is how to fund your video game. I have a bunch of amazing professionals with me that are going to talk about each of their wonderful expertises. Yes, Nigel and Anya, I'm going to professionals. Let's quickly, I'm going to introduce everyone talking on our panel. First off, to my left here is Nigel Lowrie at Devolver. How you doing, Nigel?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. To my right is Bekah Saltsman, CEO of Finji. Hi, Bekah.
Hello, Dylan.
Hello. And then down here we have Anya, Director of Games at Kickstarter.
Hello.
And then making his first PAX debut. Well, I guess that's a lie now because he said he went to PAX Australia. Callum Underwood, portfolio manager at Kowloon Knights. How you doing, Callum?
Hello. I don't know why I waved, but there we go.
So we are going to talk about game funding today. I guess I'll clarify that now. Since in games there are different. A bunch of different ways for indie developers specifically to kind of find ways to help finance their game. You have publishers, you have game funds as like a distinct entity. We're going to use funding and funds a lot in this talk, I'm sure. But to clarify that, funding, when we talk about funding, that's kind of like the action of getting financing for your game. If we describe something as a fund, that's more so like a entity that helps get you financing. So like Indie Fund or Kowloon Knights, organizations like that. And then obviously we have crowdfunding like Kickstarter and Indiegogo and other places like that. But to start off, let's start it with a kind of a slow ball here in terms of a question. I kind of want everyone to discuss like what their entity, what their company does in terms of like helping people kind of fund their games and the resources they provide. So Nigel, do you want to start with Devolver?
Yeah, sure. Devolver is a publisher, whatever that really means in 2020 anymore. We fund games fully, partially, and that could range anywhere between $0 for people that we've worked with before that bring their own funding to in the millions, depending on how large of the team it is. And we will put forth the dev advances. We put forth marketing, localization, production, music licensing, everything that's on the table that the developer needs. I guess in probably the most traditional sense of folks that are on this panel. Maybe it's weird to say, but maybe we're the most related to the old guard actually of publishing, because we will fund things, but we have no development resources ourselves. We don't have any crowdfunding ourselves. It's just money that we don't bring outside investors in ourselves. It's just Devolver will put up the funding that way, and then work with the developer in every facet that they need, depending on what it is they need. So in a world of constantly changing publishing, I'd say that we're maybe the most weird to say that maybe the most traditional in that sense, because I think you'll find out here in a second, the rest of the folks on the panel have some really new and creative ways of funding games. But yeah, that's what we do here at Devolver.
Awesome. Bekah, do you want to talk about what Finji does? And I think Nigel helped, set it up in terms of like, how is Finji separate from like the more traditional ways of maybe Devolver or older publishers?
Yeah, Finji is actually super weird. So Finji as a studio is actually an independent development studio. So we make games. We have our lead engineer, we have 2 QA representatives, we have audio, we have art, like internal to Finji. But in addition to that, because we have to make and publish our own games, we will publish other people's games. We're very, very, very low volume. We usually take on kind of like 1 big release a year. I've done 2 before, and it's difficult, especially when one of those is your own. So yeah, because of my particular job, because I do self-publish my own titles, I have all of the connections out of necessity to kind of all of the larger storefronts in existence. So like I work directly with Nintendo and Sony and Microsoft, also Epic and Steam and Humble and even itch.io. All of these are biz dev relationships that I have for my own titles. So I use those to represent other titles as well. For funding, Finji internal, we are completely bootstrapped for the most part. And our main goal generally is to sort of find the biggest fan when it comes to a storefront to stand in the corner with us. So for example, if we take Overland, we were an Apple Arcade launch title, and kind of Apple was our main partner. They were kind of the most excited about the game. With Tunic, that's an Xbox console launch exclusive. So that is our sort of biggest fan in our corner. And this is a term that we're going to probably talk about, but those are called co-marketing partners. And those are usually larger companies that are the most excited to help back a title to launch. A lot of Finji's funding is a mix of all of these things. So we have past titles which have revenue that comes in. We have our co-marketing agreements. Sometimes those do involve some funding options. We also use outside investments depending on the title that comes in. Finji itself has only done one loan in the past on our internal development, but I mean, I have indie fund games. I have like other investments on past titles from external, like when you fund a game, you're trying to figure out the best, we call it the best possible package to fund a game. Finji also does a lot of bridge funds internally for our titles. So if things take slightly too long, I pull directly from Finji's budget to get titles to launch.
Awesome. Anya, in case people don't know about Kickstarter yet, do you want to give a light overview of Kickstarter's crowdfunding kind of platform and like what it provides, and maybe like in case people don't know what it doesn't provide in terms of like, you know, helping video games specifically kind of crowdfund and then get to market?
Yeah, now for something completely different. So Kickstarter is a crowdfunding company. We are an all or nothing crowdfunding company. Specifically, what that means is if you ask for $50,000, if you are able to raise $50,000 and anything above that, you keep all of it. If you do not raise $50,000, then there is no exchange of money. We are also not an equity-based platform. We really believe in keeping things as independent as possible. We don't want people to necessarily be beholden to stakeholders. If that's something you're interested in, there are other crowdfunding sites and opportunities, but we hold pretty strong to those morals. We are based in Brooklyn, New York. Everyone thinks we're in San Francisco. We are not. We are one of the few tech companies not based in the Bay Area. So it makes us a little bit different in that sense too. Obviously everybody is remote right now, but we have people based in formerly San Francisco, Portland, Europe, Canada, kind of all over, but our main headquarters are in New York City. We are able to provide crowdfunding. That's like our main sort of thing, right? So $20 gets you a game at the end of the day. That can take up to 6 months to make, that can take up to 3 years to make. It's kind of up to the developer. We do our best to do as much communication as we possibly can with developers. We do our best to have as much communication between developers and backers, but it is sort of a relationship that is up to the backer and the developer. We call people creators just because we have more than just games, even though games is roughly about, games is about a third of everything that's brought in. There's about $5.2 million US dollars pledged to Kickstarter as a whole, and about 1.2 billion of that is just specifically for games. So it's a pretty large community. So in addition to funding, we also have access to about roughly 3.1, 3.2 million backers specifically just in the games category. So there's a huge community of people that are willing to kind of go on this fun, wild game creation journey with you.
Awesome. And Callum, talk to us about Kowloon Nights and game funds and kind of like how they stand separate from what people might traditionally expect from a publisher.
Yeah, so the end result of working with Kowloon Nights versus someone like Devolver for a developer should kind of be the same, in that your game still is marketed, you still have PR, you still do QA, you do porting, you do testing and submissions and so on and so forth. But we're specifically a fund rather than a publisher, which means we are a very small company. We have about 5 staff, a handful of advisors. We have a lot of games. We announced 30 signed games a while ago. We're above that now. We don't have to worry about things that publishers have to worry about so much. To echo kind of Bekah's comment, we could launch a few games on a single day and not really worry, because it's not actually us as the people at the fund directly helping the developers. So we provide project investment, so not equity. What I mean by that is we give money for the game. If the game makes money, we get money back. We don't take any part of the company or anything like that, which is equity investment. But we're providing the capital or the funds for the developers to pay themselves and their salaries and contractors and so forth, but also to cover everything else. So the main difference that we'll see between somebody pitching to Kowloon Knights versus pitching to a more traditional publisher is, with a traditional publisher, usually, and again, I'll probably mention this a lot of times, every publisher is different, but usually you're expecting the publisher to handle certain services, again, the biz dev relationships, the PR, the marketing, and they'll have internal teams. Sure, they can outsource some of that, but really there's people at that company managing it. Whereas we exist to serve the pretty niche and pretty narrow subsection of developers that either have a lot of experience in or really want to self-publish and go down their own path of doing things. That might be developers who've worked with publishers in the past and had very good relationships, but want to do things for themselves. It might be, commonly we see people who are leaving AAA to found their own studios and have been through the shipping cycle a few times and know what they need to do, but not exactly how to do it, and just need the funds to do that. And we focus on around $500,000 to $5 million per title, which is also, for those of you new to games funding, somewhat niche. Most of the pitches I usually see per year are kind of under 1 million in terms of volume, and it gets smaller as you kind of go up from that. But there's still many devs that live within that space. So yeah, we're a fund, not a publisher, which means we give you all the money to pay people to do the things you need to do for your game, and we don't do it ourselves. And there's certain terms and kind of ways of us doing business that reflect that fact. Like one of the key ones, I think, is that the developer takes the payment from the platform rather than us. So if you have your game on Steam, you make money on Steam, the developer will get that money into their account and then pay us, rather than the other way around, which can help with cash flow issues or things like that. But there's a few things we do differently because very specifically we're a fund. That's not to say that we're better than publishers whatsoever. I think it's very important developers understand what they want from a partner, and some of those really need a publisher or want a publisher or just want to do their thing and have someone else handle it, and some of those really want to do things themselves. Some of those people are better at that than others.
Right.
What I find really interesting, I'm actually going to bounce onto that. Most developers often end up with both. They have both publisher and investment, and Kowloon is the investment, and then they need the help with the biz dev side of things. I find very few people who are able to do both without having quite a large staff to sort of handle both pieces of it. So yeah.
It depends what you mean by publisher. So I agree,
Yes.
but this is something I've been talking to Felix actually, who works with you. What I think is the gap between requiring a publisher and just taking a bunch of money and doing it yourselves, because you're right, a team of two who did Sea Salt, which was a Kowloon funded game, right? That's a small indie game. It did okay, did well, it made money, but those two people you can't require those two people to do everything it takes to ship a successful indie game. So they use capital to pay other people and other agencies. So they had a marketing agency, they had a PR agency, they had a QA house, they had a porting house. And I think the gap between them is either if you're big enough to do it yourselves, which a good few of our studios are, they have 30 to 50 staff in the studio, or they're a much larger team that has a smaller team working on a game and can support with others. Is like a studio manager function at a smaller company. So it is somebody who uses that budget to go and work with partners and work with agencies and so things. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be a publisher, or they could use those money to like pay people to do that. And I think there's we've had a lot of conversations actually with publishers about co-investing along with publishers, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't work out, it usually comes down to generally the publishers that you'll normally hear of have certain business models that assume they're fully funding or assume they're doing something certain. And for a developer to already be giving away a portion of their revenue to Kowloon for taking all of the risk on the money, there's just not enough left for the developer. And so we all end up walking away, or we walk away. So yeah, I totally agree. But I think with Kowloon, it actually tends to not be the publisher who's the other person. It's they hire people to manage that from their studio, or they're able to manage it themselves, which is even more of a niche than before.
And there's also one last thing is, that gap is, I think, is being filled with the past few years. There's people that are with a lot of experience that have become consultants and really helped guide smaller studios. So they may go find a marketing agency or whatever, but the people that did Dead Cells and some other folks, I think Untitled Goose Game, they've been working with people like Nick Sutner, or I forget the gentleman that worked with Dead Cells, and they have a lot of experience and help. They're not part of the team, but they're guiding these teams along and helping them either find funding or what they should be doing with marketing, or how they should handle working with people like Apple or Xbox. So there's just so many options that are popping up, and there are gaps there, but they're getting filled with some pretty smart people too. Just about finding, this is what we're talking today, finding out what your team needs, or you as a solo developer need, and be comfortable with that.
And folks like Pop Agenda Co as well. Like, it's even blurring the lines of what is a marketing agency versus what is a publisher versus what is a biz dev consultant. And it's exactly what you said. People who've been doing it long enough and are smart enough and connected enough and friendly enough, like they end up filling those gaps because you can just fill your knowledge from other people. So I agree. I think that's the hardest part, honestly, of trying to describe publishing in a general sense. And we discussed this a little bit before the call, is just that it varies so much from even game to game, never mind company to company, that it's really hard to make grand sweeping statements about it. And you can only really speak to the truth that you yourself know.
It does sort of seem like the games industry is almost sort of trying to follow like a Hollywood model, but because the games industry does not want to model, we don't want to model ourselves after like, movies or music or anything like that. So like traditionally, right, what we're basically talking about, these people coming in for like Untitled Goose Game and Dead Cells, is essentially an agent, right? Someone to sort of like take care of you, or like a manager. But we don't have those systems set up within the games industry. I know that I think like CAA, Creative Artists Agency, and a couple others, there are like games agents, but because we are so protective of our space as like games industry people, like we just don't trust suits.
Well, and on top of that, like the agencies that you're describing don't like, we even talked about this just slightly before, like we're going to have to define a bunch of things that we talk about. And even within like CAA or UTA or any of those, like they're good for drumming up business, and they're good for representing you for like more celebrity sort of things, or they represent esports, but they don't do the day-to-day business that we're doing. They'll help you through a contract, but once they're past that, like if you're like, okay, well, how should I put together my store page? Or like that's so outside of their day-to-day business. And I think it's really interesting what Callum from Kowloon, that was really funny in my brain.
It's okay. I'll give you that. It's all right.
What I think is really interesting, because I didn't actually mention this when I described Finji, but what you described, sort of, we are technically a publisher, but from the beginning, we refer to ourselves as like the weird indie games label for publishing, because what Adam and I view ourselves as, and why our percentage is historically very low for games publishing, because we view ourselves as a development assistant and biz dev arm of your team.
See, we would fit together much better than traditional publishers. And I've had many calls with publishers even myself, when I worked at a publisher, I would have calls with Kowloon, and we always ended up going, there's so much crossover in what we do that we just can't. And what you don't want, and every publisher runs their business differently, but something that I always came back to is it's very difficult to, if you have a slate of games, let's say if you're launching 5 games a year, and for 4 of those games you're getting 30% as the publisher, and one of those games you're getting 5%. It's very hard to just keep those all in your brain at the same time, knowing that one means significantly less money for you or for the dev than the others. So that's why things like Finji, I see Finji more like a Pop Agenda Co, a Nick Sutton type of thing, because you're focusing on a specific thing and doing it very well. And that fits better with people like Kowloon, who focus on a very specific thing. I would also argue Devolver focus on a very specific thing, but that's just the type of games and devs that they work with rather than anything else. So yeah, I agree. Let's collab.
All right. Well, that went in a bunch of different directions, and crap, I wrote down so many things. No, it's good. What's great about this group of people is that you all have kind of like a distinct understanding of like where you all reside in this landscape, and I'm trying to understand, trying to aid the person that like has no idea, like doesn't even see the landscape, or doesn't know what the topography is, or doesn't know what a map looks like. And it's hard for me to find the proper question, but I mean, like, so I'm just going to kind of briefly go over, like, in a traditional sense, kind of like the steps of, if you approach a publisher, if you approach someone like Finji, or if you like decide to do a Kickstarter. But like, and this knowledge has kind of been like diffused a lot and has been put out there, but it's like, assuming, and we're going to go in with a couple assumptions. We assume you have a game to show. We're going to assume that the game is like a certain amount of long, like it has enough that it's playable, it's in a playable state. We are assuming that you have a contact at, whether it's Devolver or some other publisher, or you know who to talk to. Which, I mean, some of that information is basically like, and everyone briefly mentioned it here, like a lot of the groundwork and like starting these conversations is literally like having a conversation, right? Like, I mean, everyone on this call I have met in like really different circumstances. I think Bekah, I just kind of cold called you, like we reached out to you to discuss something. Callum, I think we became mutuals on Twitter. Anya, we were introduced through a mutual friend. Nigel, I just met for the first time here. But like, I think the intimidating part is like doing that first step, and kind of like how you reach out to someone. So like, say you have a game, you have something to show, you have a prototype, you think you have a pretty good elevator pitch to bring it either to a crowdfunding platform or to a publisher or whatever. Like, what else does someone need to have? Like, what else does someone, and there's a bevy of different things, but like kind of want to go over what is the packet of materials that you are expecting when someone wants to approach you about getting funding for their game?
I think the Kickstarter side is probably going to be vastly different from everything else, just because it's a totally different world. But yeah, there's a couple of things quickly. So you need to have 30 seconds of gameplay. It's just required. It's kind of the only way, it's the easiest way for people to kind of see what's going on. There's a list of things, but I would say if I had to have the 2 most important things, 30 seconds of gameplay, and you need to have a community that already exists. If you're coming to Kickstarter to like build a community from the ground up, it's going to be a miserable experience. So you definitely need to have an existing community of some kind.
What is gameplay to Kickstarter?
Gameplay is 30 seconds of what is as close to what the final project is going to look like.
I didn't know that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, like if that's like a vertical slice, or if it's, a demo of some kind. And it's just from the perspective of like, it doesn't have to be final, right? But if you're just using boxes, and those boxes are ultimately going to be like humanoid characters, it's impossible for a backer to understand. That relationship is very different, where your backers are not like your publishing partners of any kind, right? They don't necessarily understand the lingo. They don't necessarily understand what actually goes into a game. In their eyes, they're like, but I just want the thing of what you told me you were going to make. Right. So sometimes, I mean,
even most publishers need a demo. I just didn't know. I didn't know that Kickstarter also required you to be that far along.
And Go
we
ahead.
can engage with assets and like prototype versus vertical slice, which those are two different things. Prototype is like my mechanics work and my systems work. And like vertical slice is like I could take this to a PAX show floor and show it to fans. Like two totally different things. Also, apologize. My neighbor is mowing their lawn. It's really obnoxious.
My neighbor's
can't-
dog is barking, so
Oh my
yeah, in
God.
the same boat.
It like started as soon as this call started. Okay, so there's like these two different things, and that's like very game development lingo. Prototype, vertical slice. They're even different links. But a publisher, depending on the publisher, to be perfectly honest, but especially publishers who engage with the development process from start to finish can 100% engage with a prototype because we can look at assets, we can look at 3D models, we can like see, especially in system-based games, we can like see the pieces and how they move. That's not to say every person at the publisher can, but there's always at least one. And that's even the case at consoles. Like the farther you move up, as far as like getting a project, it's often the more polished things need to look. You could send us basically garbage that moves across the screen, boxes, and we'd be like, yeah, no, we totally understand what's going on. But that's not how most people work, because most people that you talk to don't also make games.
Yeah.
And I think it's on those lines, it's important to remember, you're working on your game and you're pitching to whoever this partner is, but it's also, it's still competitive. So that partner is looking at other things, right? So we definitely have signed games based on, write-ups and just static art or GIFs. But certainly if you have 10 games in front of you and one of them has a vertical slice or a prototype, as Bekah referenced, and yours is paper or really rudimentary kind of gameplay, it may be a very good idea, but it might be hard for that particular partner in that particular moment to say, yeah, I like this idea, but this one I really can digest and know where it's going and believe that they can accomplish what they're saying they can accomplish because they put it here in front of me. So, it also just, I hate to tell developers just come back when you have something playable, because that isn't necessary, at least for us. And I don't think it's necessary for everybody, but in that competitive space of pitching, which it's a competition, whether you like it or not, people might have something that's more polished, that's just easier for the person that's giving you money and resources and time to look at and say, yeah, this is something I can digest or sell to the rest of my team. I may get it. I may love what you're doing, but then I have to go to other people on my team that just doesn't connect with immediately. Mm-hmm. If you have something playable or something, even in video form, that helps, sell the rest of the team. So, this entire talk, I'm sure, is going to be fraught with, well, it all depends and caveats, right?
Yeah.
But that's just there's no getting around it. We started this whole thing with discussing what is a publisher or what is a partner or what does this even mean? And that's the point. It's not a binary thing. It's just, there's shades of gray and there's spectrums, and you have to figure out where you fit and who might, to Bekah's point earlier, who might be your ambassador, who might be your champion, who is going to take that torch with you and run to the finish line. And so I think a lot of it, just, it's situational, but it's never going to be easy. Anyone that tells you this pitching process is going to be easy is lying to you. But yeah, having something to us, just to finish the thought, to us, we tell people we need to be able to see the fun in the game. That's the most important part. If that's a video, that's a playable, if that's, an animatic where you're mocking up other games and then pointing out what you're going to do with it, your game, that might be enough. And it's also based on the relationship. If I've worked with you before, whatever, sure. So, we'll sign, we love you, whatever you want to do next. If we've never worked with you before, or you've never had a game kind of commercially released, there is a little more requirement, at least on our end, to have a little more proof in that pudding, if you will, right? So it depends, and this is why we have these different partners, different representations on this panel, because it's different from different partners.
That's a good point, though, about the scale of all the experience. So usually when I'm looking at games that are being pitched, I'm figuring out, like, there's always the business angle. Like, will this game make enough money for the developer and us to make money? That otherwise you will go out of business and not be able to help anyone else. Is this the right team to make the game, and can they pull it off? And if I signed a paper pitch recently, actually. So a paper pitch, for those who don't know, is I have an idea for a game. Here is a bunch of text about it. Here are some images of what it might look like. And this was interesting to me because it had 0 assets. Like usually paper pitches I've signed in the past at least have concept art and they've put something on paper. This had nothing. It was just an idea, but the team, I had very good references from the team from other people. They'd shipped stuff before. They showed me the game that's shipping at the end of this year. Like, I know this team can ship games and they have a certain look and feel about it. And I love the idea enough that prototype funding makes sense. Everyone does prototype funding a little bit differently. The way that Kowloon does it is we don't really look at prototype funding in a different manner to other games. Let's say if a game is going to cost $1 million to make, and they already have a prototype and the $1 million is from then on, fine. We just, we sign it and away we go. And we don't have milestones at Kowloon. That's also pretty different. But if they want to make a prototype, we'll say, okay, the first $200,000 is to make a prototype. But then we have a milestone, which is like, we think this is cool and you think this is cool. Let's continue funding the rest. But it's not a $200,000 deal. It's still $1 million deal because you're expecting to pay for the whole thing. But yeah, to get a paper pitch signed, I'd be so impressed if someone managed that without having shipped stuff before, without having a team who's shipped stuff before, and a team who's worked together before as well. It's all good and well and good playing fantasy football with team members, but if you never shipped a game before, that's also a risk. Yeah. And then again, as Nigel said, if you've worked together, it's much, much easier. Like we often do repeat funding for people we've worked with. And the problem with all of this is this all reduces risk for everyone involved, and that's great, and good games get made, but this is exclusive and elitist, and it makes it very, very difficult for anyone leaving school or who hasn't made games before to like everything that we've just said, even Kickstarter, you need a prototype to get funding. Like, how do you make a prototype? How do you get funds to do that? Do you do it in your spare time? How do you find a team? And that's we could do a whole nother panel about that.
Right.
I think that's something that generally the games industry needs to work on over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Because I think it's one of the biggest blockers to like diversity and inclusion is just people getting even beyond that first stage.
Well, and I kind of want to summarize that point that you all were making, that basically like the burden of proof, the amount of burden of proof depends on like what your prior experience is. So like if people that are watching this and if they're like new to the industry or trying to make their first project and go about like trying to find a partner for it, like requires more proof. And
unless they have if they have a prototype and it's fun, I don't care who they are. Like Kowloon is different, right? We want people who can self-publish, but at Super Hot Presents, so where I used to work for Raw Fury, and I'm sure Devolver, etc. Like if they have a prototype that blows you away, like that is the rarest. Let me swore. I stopped myself. That is the rarest thing in this industry, to see a prototype that blows you away. So if they haven't made games before, you can work that out.
Right, but I think that's
totally
the adequate
ways around this though. Like, so because we obviously work with like students, we mentor lots of people. Like having that prototype of your game, like you're probably not going to get signed if it's your first game on a paper prototype. However, if you have been making things and putting them up on itch, like you have just been, like your hobby forever has just been creating things. Like there's a lot more confidence going into that. Plus you've already been building an audience for the weirdo stuff that you're making. Like there's so many ways into independent development. You've created a following for yourself. Like you could show up with a prototype that is kind of ugly. That might just be blocks moving around on a screen. That might be really, really small. And like, because you have made stuff, a publisher can look at that and be like, man, you've got the chops. Like you can do this. And what you need right now is mentorship and funding. Like there's a lot of ways into this for people that are really just trying to break into the industry. That's not to say it's going to be easy, because you have to build that social, like you have to put yourself out there. You have to be on forums talking to other people who will champion your work, that will talk about your work. That like, that's how you build a Twitter following. Like, we didn't come up with this on our own. It was because we were putting ourselves out there, like, back in the day on TigSource. Like, it's just a piece of this. You're joining Discords about game making. The people that you're talking to about making games are going to talk about your projects on their social media as well. Like, and all of these things add up to be able to sort of get through the noise.
Yeah. There's another interesting thing you brought up, or you press upon the importance of like, and I think Nigel in that GDC talk he gave a couple years ago used the term brutal honesty, or just like, critical feedback, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes we treat pitching as the first opportunity to get feedback, as opposed to like should be the umpteenth time. Like
Right.
you should, like Bekah said, like as you progress through a project, you should be getting more and more feedback. And I think as someone that hasn't engaged with that a lot, I think like at least it helps either build your confidence in what you're making and maybe like solidify how to discuss that with a funding partner, versus like seeing where the cracks are and like being able
I think
to.
it's more. I'm always hesitant to suggest to people to ask other game developers because
Right. Yes.
everyone has their own vision and knows their own stuff, right? But I think you just touched on it. It's one big example I use is I got pitched a rhythm game once. Now I'm not a rhythm game aficionado, but I can play rhythm games. And we'll simplify it incredibly. The way that rhythm games work is you have a certain window of time in which to like hit a button, and then it like gives you a perfect or so. And the window of time in a normal game might be this. In this game, it was like this. So it was super difficult, and I was getting really frustrated playing it. And I told the developer this, and they said, "Oh yeah, we didn't know that. Like, we can fix that though, of course." And my like, I was immediately on the back foot because I thought you were making and pitching a rhythm game. You should have known this already. And so when I tell devs to ask other developers, it's not to like change your game based on what they say. It's to anticipate similar feedback from other people, right? And then be able to answer those questions and like why you decided to do that, etc.
You're asking, does this work? Is this broken? Am I missing something? Can you poke a hole in this design? Can you see where it's going to break later? It's not to actually, I mean, even within Finji, like I mentioned, like we help with the design process. That is not Adam going like, this is what I think you should do. Because that's crazy. I don't want to make Tunic. Andrew's making Tunic, but Andrew does need a design mentor, which is Andrew coming in and being like, here are the things that I'm doing. Here's the part that I just built. Where are the problems?